verses. And then tonight we're going to talk about his thorn in the flesh. Now that thorn in the flesh is related to the vision that he had. And we're going to see some important things about that thorn in the flesh. So let's get right in. He starts in chapter 12 at verse 7. He says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. So let's think about this thorn for just a minute. A thorn was a sharp splinter, or it was more than what you find on a rose bush. Okay, it would have been something like a sharp stake that was just tormenting the Apostle Paul. One time I was pulling weeds. I'd been over to pull a weed, and there was one stalk that stuck up like that all by itself, and when I bent over to pull it out, I'm not real bright, I stuck the stalk right in my eye. Okay? Shocked me so bad. You know, if you hit your face or your head on something, you jerk back. Well, I jerked back, hit my head on the concrete on the steps that were right there. Then I got blood rolling down the back of my neck. My eye is swollen shut. I can't see what's going on. That's the kind of thorn that Paul was dealing with. Okay? It wasn't just a pinprick. This is a thorn or a splinter. It was often used in Hellenistic writings or Greek writings. The great Greek writers would use a word like this. In Genesis, the 50th chapter, at verse 20, we're introduced to a concept that I think I want to develop to some greater extent as we go through this discussion tonight. Genesis, the 50th chapter, there is the story of Joseph. And of course, he encounters his brothers. We know what his brothers have done. They've sold him into slavery. He's gone through all kinds of trials and difficulties while he was in slavery down in Egypt. And finally, he gets back together with his brothers. In Genesis, the 50th chapter, at verse 20, he makes this statement to them, and I'll just paraphrase it very quickly. He says, what you did, you intended to be for evil, but it turned out to be for good. And if you're familiar with history, you know that one of the things that preserved the family of the Israelites, or the family of Israel, was the fact that Joseph was down in Egypt and he had managed to gather grain into silos so that that grain that they had harvested during the 7 years of plenty was able to sustain them through the 7 years of famine. So much so that Israel sent his sons down to Egypt to buy grain, because that was what had happened as a result of them selling Joseph into Egyptian captivity or into Egyptian slavery. Now Joseph says, you meant that for evil. I have no doubt that his brothers all understood just exactly what he was saying. So we're introduced to this concept, and we'll develop that concept a little bit more as we go on. This idea that it was going to torment him is an interesting idea. It was to beat someone with your knuckles, okay? Not just a fist, but to beat someone with your knuckles. When I was much younger, one of the things that I did when I was preaching in Brookings was, because Brookings is a little bitty town, you have to volunteer to do something in a little bitty town like that, and they wanted me to be a fireman. And Mark will tell you that that's not a good thing to be in the land of the great woods. So I didn't want to be a fireman, so I worked on the ambulance. I was an EMT. And every once in a while, we'd have to go to the care facility that was there in Brookings and pick up someone who was having difficulty. Well, we walked into the care facility, and this little old lady that was about that tall walked up behind me and whacked me with her knuckles right in the back of my head, laid me out, just knocked me silly. And you wouldn't think that that little bitty lady could do that much damage to a guy, but she did. So I can understand what Paul is talking. This is not just something that's kind of bothersome to Paul. This is a big deal. And Paul says, it tormented me. It rapped on me with its knuckles constantly. And it was going to do some things for Paul. Now, a lot of people have suggested that they know what this was. You know, when I was starting preaching, I preached at Sunnyvale, California, and was preaching with a mentor. He was not that much older than I was, but he was certainly wiser than I was. And Bill used to say he knew exactly what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. He used to tease me about it. He said Paul's thorn in the flesh was young preachers, like Timothy. Now, I wanted to have a comeback to that, but I didn't. I just couldn't think of one. People have suggested that they think his thorn in the flesh was all kinds of things. Some people think it was maybe malaria or migraines or arthritis or epilepsy. And you can understand why somebody might have those kinds of problems after they've been through the things that Paul has been through. I mean, the poor man has been beat up. So might that cause him to have migraine headaches? I don't know, but it certainly makes some sense. And Paul kind of uses some language periodically that gives you a hint that he was having some of these difficulties. I have no idea whether that was the thorn in the flesh, but it is an interesting speculation that some people have made. Some people have said it was a speech impediment. Remember, right here in Corinth, he had to deal with people that said his bodily presence is impressive, but his speech is weak and contemptible. Now, I can't imagine that Paul's speech was unintelligible. Paul was one of the most educated men of his day, wrote some incredible letters. I can't imagine that a man like that couldn't speak, but maybe he had problems with his speech. I just don't know. Some people have said it was eye problems. Remember, he did say, you see how large a letter I've written with my own hand. And maybe it was that as Paul aged, or perhaps because of the difficulties that he had eye problems, yeah.
And I've heard that eye problems, one explained too, because of the heavenly vision, that he actually saw that this was to be a reminder to him that he should not speak of these things, and it would remind him the rest of his days.
Makes some sense, yeah.
He also states that the people love him so much they would give him their eye.
That's true. That's true. He made that statement as well.
He could have got flash burn from that heavenly vision, like a welding burn.
That's true. Could be. It could be. No man can look on God and live. Of course, that's what God told Moses. I'll put my hand over you and cover you. I'll pass by. You'll look at my backside. So maybe it was that. You remember the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus was transfigured before the apostles, and I like to think of that as Jesus, when he came to the earth, he had to turn his wick down. Because if he walked around with his wick turned up, people couldn't stand it. So he came here and he turned his wick way down so that people could be around him. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, I like to think, I don't know, it doesn't say this, I like to think just for a minute Jesus turned the wick all the way back up. And when he turned it back up, it was impressive. So maybe that's what caused him to have eye problems. Makes some sense, yeah.
Dean, and we're kind of dancing around this, and really, it doesn't matter really what that thorn was, but it was effective. It did buffet Paul. In fact, I know we're going to get into this, the fact he was praying about it.
Yes.
So whatever it was that God gave him, it had its effect on him.
Yes, it did. And we'll develop that idea more as we go on. But some have suggested that it was the people that were constantly following him the false teachers, the Judaizing teachers, who were hounding the apostle everywhere he went. And Paul had to deal with that constantly, so much so that he was let down over the wall in a basket. He had to escape sometimes for his life. He was stoned. There were people around Paul that made his life miserable. Now, the thing that I want you to see about this, and it's important, and you see it right here, this is a messenger of Satan. I don't believe that God gave this to Paul. It was something that was given to him, but it was given to him not by God, but by Satan. And Paul calls it a messenger of Satan. It's not something that happened because of God. John Wesley, yeah, go ahead.
Kind of like Job, where God said, okay, Satan, you do anything you want, you just can't take his life.
Could be. It could well be. John Wesley, very good biblical thinker. I disagree with some of his conclusions, but John Wesley said, the evil that happens to us doesn't happen to us because of what God does. The evil that happens to us because of the evil men that are around us. So it's not God causing this, it's Satan causing this. Now, it was related in some ways to the revelation that he had or the vision that he had. That's exactly right. But I don't think that argues that it came from God. Yeah.
No, it doesn't say that it came from God, but it is related to the revelations, and that this thorn in the flesh, it said, was given to me. It was allowed. Has God done things and allowed things to happen? Yes. It doesn't mean God did it, but he allowed that to happen, that he might not be exalted above measure.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. I mean, God allowed Gonzaga to be beaten last night in basketball. Sorry. Some of us get more into basketball than others of us. Yeah, there were things that happened to Paul, not that they were caused by God, but God could have stopped them at any point. God could have stopped it. At any point in time, this messenger of Satan could have been taken away. Paul knows that. He understands that this messenger could be taken away. Now, I want to read to you from Phillips' translation. You know my habit. I like to read a lot of different translations of the Bible. Phillips, J.B. Phillips, was an Anglican clergyman who lived in England around 1950, right about the end of the World War, and he translated at least parts of the Bible. He was a good Greek student. He had studied classical Greek at Oxford, and he translated many parts of the New Testament, although not all of it. He translated 4 books of the Old Testament. His translation is called the English Bible. I hesitate to say it's a translation. It's more like, well, he never liked the term paraphrase. He called it a dynamic equivalency. His goal, his stated goal in translating the Bible was to make the people that read it feel the same things that the people that read the original felt. And he felt like he had to make it in an understandable kind of language so that people could use it. Now, he worked primarily with people, well, he says they were just about the age that they were leaving school. I don't know exactly how old that is, but it's probably 13, 14, around that age when people started leaving school. So it's not a difficult translation. Now, he does say in the preface to his translation that if you really want to know what the book says, if you want to know literally what the book says, you can find that in other translations. He never claimed that this was a literal translation. He claimed that this was a paraphrase, and it reads in some ways more like a commentary than it does a translation of the Bible. But I want to read to you the way that he paraphrased this passage, 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, right here about verse 7. Now, because he paraphrased, the verse markings are not in his paraphrase, and they really don't make much sense. So you have to be a little bit careful when you read it. But he started out saying, because of the extravagance of those revelations, and so I wouldn't get a big head, I was given the gift of a handicap to keep me in constant touch with my limitations. Now, I think that's a pretty good way to try to understand what's going on here. I don't know what that handicap was. I don't know what the thorn in the flesh was. People have speculated about what the thorn in the flesh was. It's always dangerous to speculate and present it as if you know exactly what it was. He doesn't try to do that. He says, I was given a handicap to keep me in touch with my limitations. Then he goes on. Satan's angel did his best to get me down. That was why Satan's angel was there. What he did, in fact, was push me to my knees. No danger of me being walking around high and mighty. The angel of Satan pushed him to his knees. It caused him to approach God in prayer. That's not what Satan intended when Satan sent this thorn to torment the Apostle Paul because of the revelations that he had been given. He goes on. He says, at first, I didn't think of it as a gift. Who would? I mean, nobody is going to be initially excited about this thorn that is beating them all the time. Paul says, initially I didn't think of it as a gift, and I begged God to remove it. 3 times I did that. Now, we can learn a lot about prayer. I wish we had the time to talk about all of the things that are a part of prayer, but Paul clearly says he talked to God about it 3 times. Not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. And God was not granting him the thing that he was asking for, that it would be taken away, that somehow it would be removed, and it would no longer be tormenting him. Paul was persistent in prayer, and that's, if there's anything we can learn about prayer, not just from this passage, but from a lot of other passages, be persistent. It's not good enough to just ask one time. Then he goes on. He says, then he told me, that's God, my grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weakness. Once I heard that, I was glad to let it happen. I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in my weakness. Now, there's something to be learned from that. That's not the kind of thing that we appreciate intuitively. When there is a thorn that's bothering us, we would approach God and ask it to be taken away. And Paul did too. Please take this away. But then he began to realize, this is God strengthening me. It's God's strength working in my weakness. You look like you had a comment.
Just some thoughts again. If let's, for instance, as Clinton brought up with regards to what the brethren said, if they could, they would pluck out their own eyes and give it to him. And you look at that, if his eyesight was to the point of almost blindness, would that not put him in more of a state of prayer to God as well? I mean, because you can't see very well, and look at with big letters, and with eye problems come migraines and headaches. And So that's all part of the situation, which would probably have Paul into more prayer and asking for relief from that. And that's where God is the strongest in a Christian's life, is when their prayer life is appropriate.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Just a comment, Dean, on prayer in general is we need to understand as Christians that when we pray about something, sometimes no is the answer. Sometimes later is the answer, and sometimes the answer is yes. But sometimes no is the answer, and I'm reminded just the 3 times thing of Jesus in the garden. He was praying that that cup would be removed. He didn't want to die, but the answer was no. In Paul's case, the answer was no. God's will be done.
This is the way it's going to be. I have to say, I have been in positions in my life on a couple of occasions. Most recently when we lost our 2-year-old granddaughter. I prayed hard that she could live, and God said no. Now that's a bitter pill to swallow. And it caused me to question my faith. I'll be honest about it. It was a very difficult time. And a really good friend of mine said, yeah, but you have to realize this is God doing what's best. And just take confidence in the fact that God is doing what's best. If he had let Lauren live, she would have spent her whole life battling this debilitating condition that she was suffering from. And so God graciously let her die. Now, that was not my thought at the time. That was not my approach. I wanted God to take this away. I wanted God to respond. And when God said no, it shook my faith in a serious way. In fact, I blamed God. Yeah.
Before we move on, I think it's just really important to underline the application, which is what we're talking about right now, right? Is here's the situation, what was the thorn, what was the really physical ailments of Paul? Okay, that's important, we can glean from it and learn from it, but then where we're at now, and we can talk about our situations and look at more verses that we come to God in more times of need than times of prosperity, and that God is not a God of course, evil, he's only a God of good, and so we know this came from Satan. God allowed it. You go over to other verses like Romans chapter 5, first couple verses talks about in trials and tribulations, you will grow in patience. And 2 Peter, first 10 verses there, chapter 1, talks about that you will grow in kindness and brotherly love, in trials and patience, and you will grow lest you will never fall or stumble. So when you look at all that, you think, okay, this is something that he's learning and he's growing from, such as your example right there. When we have some tragedy in our life, you look at, it's hard to look at the silver lining, in other words, and instead of saying, wow, this is something I need to grow. So you get a phone call from a family member and someone's died immediately, it will change you. You have a fork in the road that you can go down a different direction. And we all have had those. And that's really, I think, part of this what we can get out of it.
Yeah, and I know that people deal with those kinds of things. Yeah, go ahead.
It's just knowing how to react, because sometimes we don't know why no has been said. And it will be some time perhaps if we even get the chance to that. Joseph, as the favorite son of Isaac, I'm sorry, not Isaac, Israel, yes, but anyways, he got sold into the slavery. He had done nothing wrong. You had to know he asked why at some point.
And he is,
He just kept going, and it wasn't until the very end when the brothers came back and he finally realized this is why all this evil had happened to me, that I could be here at this time and serve this purpose. We
And-
don't know why the no's happened, but they probably serve some purpose that we're not aware of.
and he is never criticized for what he did, for having those thoughts. In fact, you read Job. Job puts it on the line. The end of Job, he says, what is going on here? You know, he's tried to get help from his friends. Now, his friends were the worst kinds of friends in that kind of situation. But he eventually says to God, what is going on here? And God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You don't think like I think. And that's our difficulty. That's the way that we're made. We don't think like God does.
I'm just thinking again of Paul when he was met on that road to Damascus, and then he had these great scales that were over his eyes, and he was blind for 3 days, and in darkness. And then in that period of time, you know, you can imagine what he's going through in his mind. But again, Paul had to have a complete change in his life, and he got that. And after those scales came off, and he, Acts 22:16, and he was baptized and became a Christian, his whole life changed. But yet, then as a disciple of Christ, and later an apostle, then you see all of his work. You never hear anything about his eyes until this event. And then when you read the different accounts in the other books, so it was with that heavenly vision, but at the same time, this darkness that he had to go through in order to see the true light that was in Jesus, it was illuminated him in all of his writings and everything he said. You just feel it in all of his writings. They're so powerful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, it's fairly easy to deal with something for 3 days, and then God takes it away. That's as bad as it is to not be able to see for 3 days. I can give up my sight for 3 days. Now, this is a lot harder. This is continual. This does not go away. And in fact, look at the way that Phillips ends this part of his translation. Now, Paul says, I take limitations in stride and with good cheer. These limitations cut me down to size. Abuse, accidents, opposition, bad breaks. I just let Christ take over. And so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. I would not want anybody to go through what I went through when Lauren died. I think it made me a stronger Christian. I would not wish that on my worst enemy. And I'm sure that every one of us can cite numerous examples that are just like that. I wouldn't want anybody to go through it. And with Jeff, I wouldn't want anybody to go through what Jeff is going through. Maybe that turns out for good. And maybe it's because he's working for you, and God knows that you'll be there for Jeff. And that maybe all of that comes together. I don't know. I can't say. I'm always impressed with the book of Philemon. Onesimus is Philemon's slave. He's run away from Philemon. He goes to Rome, probably intending to get lost in the crowd. If you ran away from your slave owner, you probably ran to a place where people couldn't identify you very easily. And he had the misfortune when he got there of running into his old owner's best friend. And Paul converted him. And so Paul writes back to Philemon. He says, who knows? Maybe he ran away so I could convert him. I'm impressed that Paul doesn't say, I know why this happened. And Paul doesn't go into a lot of detail about what this thorn in the flesh was. But as you said, Jeff, it taught him a lesson. And that's what we need to see. Yeah.
Adversity, if we take it the right way, will make us stronger. I'm reminded of 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter likens our faith to gold passing through the furnace and driving the impurities out.
Yeah.
Adversity will make us stronger.
Yeah, I agree. And this is the point. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is perfected in your weakness. And that's something that we all need to learn. It's especially difficult, I think for men to learn that lesson, because we are not accustomed to being weak and acknowledging that we are weak. Yeah.
And with that, it's just like, in your own situation that you mentioned, we don't always understand. In fact, and Brad pointed it out very well, we may not know for a long time down the road what God's providence is through the situation in which you're going and how he will ultimately use that for his glory. You don't know. But when it happens, you will know it was God's plan. This is what he wanted me to do.
Yeah.
And so those things happen in many people's lives. The loss of a spouse. I can't imagine that. I know people here have gone through that, but that would be a terrible time and gut-wrenching and whatever. But at the same time, we don't understand God's providence and what may come out of that down the road. We just don't know.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And I will say this, let me add this. It's important when you get into a time like that you find the strongest Christian you can find and hug him real close, because that's what gets you through. I preached a sermon one time that parents are God with skin on, and I think our friends that give us that kind of counsel are God with skin on, and we need to appreciate that and be there for people when they're going through times like this. My grace is sufficient for you. I can't tell you how that happens, but I can say that it does happen. So let's talk about some life lessons, and we have to finish up here very quickly. God uses suffering to humble his creation, or God allows suffering to humble his creation, his children. If he didn't love us, he wouldn't do that. You know, in the book of Hebrews, the writer says that we have had fathers after our flesh that chastened us. They did it for our good, not for their own pleasure. They did it for our good. And it's hard to remember that when it's happening. It's hard to remember that God uses suffering to refine us, to cause us to appreciate his strength. We only appreciate really his strength when we've run out of strength. As long as I have the strength, then I rely on myself. But when I run out of strength and I have to turn to God, then it's a good thing. So God humbles us. Second thing, God allows Satan to inflict suffering. And we've talked about that already. It's not God that causes the suffering, but God allows Satan to inflict suffering. Satan does it for our harm. That's why he's doing it. But God can make that work out to our good. Yeah.
The book of Job is full of that discussion.
I'm sorry?
The book of Job covers that well.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I don't think that's the point of the book of Job. I think the point of the book of Job is, would you serve God if there was nothing in it for you? And I think that's the point of the book of Job. Job has to ask the question, and his wife tells him, curse God and die. There is nothing in this. Would you serve God if there was nothing in it for you? Yeah.
Is not suffering also the consequence of the sin in the Garden of Eden?
Oh, sure. Sure, suffering is always. Sin can, when there's sin in my life, I bring all kinds of evil on myself. Now, that's fairly easy to deal with, okay? Because I know full well that the reason this thing happened is because I was a dummy and I sinned. It's kind of like I had a heart attack, okay? The reason I had a heart attack was I didn't get enough exercise, I had a lousy diet, my cholesterol was out of control, and I wound up having a heart attack. Now, that's not God doing that to humble me. That was me being stupid, and I suffered the consequences of it. I talked to a guy one time who said, my car keeps getting stolen. Every time I park it down by the bar, it gets stolen. I said, have you ever thought that maybe you shouldn't park it there? Yeah, go ahead.
Also true that thorns and thistles happen because of sin. And one can innocently step on a thorn. It just exists because of the nature of where creation is now because of that sin. In innocence, we can trip over something or be affected by something that, and but we use that lesson to grow through.
Good point. We live in a fallen world. We have to deal with the fact that the world is not what it was created to be. We messed it up, okay? And because of that, that's going to come back and bite us constantly. Yeah, Brad.
The scriptures say, Lord disciplines those whom he loves. And growth does not happen without pain. I am a physical manifestation of that. The growth I experienced was filled with great pain. But growth does not happen without pain and suffering. You don't get stronger lifting weights and all that without those muscles and joints hurting an awful lot.
Yeah, that's why I quit doing that, by the way. But I know exactly the point that you're making. You know, that's why we quit. It hurts. So we quit. We never get to the point of seeing the benefit. And that's what happens with a lot of Christians. We stop being a Christian because of some opposition. We never get to see the benefit. Yeah, Dave.
When one suffers from sin and is patient in that and deals with it, that's all fine and well, but it's on your own. But when you suffer for doing that which is good in the eyes of God, now that brings glory to God because you're willing to suffer for his sake.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. God uses suffering to draw us to himself. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to ignore you.
No, that's okay. Would that go along with fasting? That's kind of suffering because it's harder to glorify the Lord. But a good fasting, I do it sometimes, but just from certain things I fast. Chocolate.
You know, to try to answer every question, we just need to sit down and talk about it a lot further. I'm not ignoring your question. I just think that's a kind of question that demands a lot more time than what we have in this class to answer it. So I would love to sit down with you and talk about that question, okay? God uses suffering to draw us to himself. It's like I said, as long as we've got the strength to deal with it, we don't need God. It's when we run out of strength that we need God. And that's what we have to appreciate. God's grace is sufficient for all of our problems. That's hard to see sometimes. It's hard to really comprehend that. It's hard to put it into practice, but it is true. God's grace is sufficient. We have a hard time, or I have a hard time, just leaning on the grace of God. God's power is perfected in our weakness. And then finally, there's a way of understanding suffering so that suffering will continue to bring us closer to God. And I hope, if anything, I hope that we've learned that tonight. Next week we'll talk about Paul coming the third time to Corinth, and we'll go through that very quickly. A lot of that is stuff that we've already discussed, and it's just a reiteration. We will talk about how Paul says that he really does prefer to be able to come to them in love next week. So hopefully we'll be able to get through that. Thank you. It was a good class.